There's a great experiment where rats were given a lever to press for cocaine, and after learning that it releases a lot of dopamine, the rats will press that lever till exhaustion or death, which is essentially the model of addiction that we see in humans. But if the cocaine is then removed, eventually they won't press the lever anymore. Now, if that same rat, after a period of time, is then exposed to a very painful foot shock, the first thing the rat will do is run over and start pressing that lever again. And that's really powerful because it shows that when individuals are under extreme stress, they are more vulnerable to going back to compulsive overconsumption of our drug of choice because their brain has already encoded using these high dopamine rewards as a way to get out of that pain.
Okay, so what do I need to do to make sure that I can knock the bad habits and add some new ones?
Here's what we do.
Dr. Anna Lemke is chief of the Stanford Addiction Clinic and a world-leading expert on the subject of dopamine.
And now she's returned to warn us that addiction is the modern plague
and how we can rewire our brains to take back control.
On average, it takes 4 weeks for people to get out of constant state of craving. But here's the problem. Our survival depends on figuring out how to live in a world of abundance. For example, we're now seeing the drugification of human connection through social media, dating apps, and now artificial intelligence designed to flatter, to validate. There's no friction there. And so it's pulling us away from the hard things that we need to be doing in real life to cultivate real life relationships. We cannot go in that direction because in a world of abundance, we are entertaining ourselves to death.
Sounds like a good way to go.
It's really not, because the relentless pursuit of pleasure leads to anhedonia.
What's that mean?
The inability to take joy in anything at all.
Teach me everything. I see messages all the time in the comments section that some of you didn't realize you didn't subscribe. So if you could do me a favor and double check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's the free thing that anybody that watches this show frequently can do to help us here, to keep everything going in this show in the trajectory it's on. So please do double check if you subscribed. And thank you so much, because in a strange way, you're part of our history and you're on this journey with us. And I appreciate you for that. So yeah, thank you. Dr. Anna Lemke. For anyone that might not know you, and they didn't watch our conversation last time, which was a fantastic conversation, one of my favorites of all time, and also I know Jack has said to me as well that it was one of his favorites of all time. Who are you and what have you spent your career doing if you had to summarize it? What are the reference points that your wisdom draws upon and the experiences you've had and the people you've worked with?
I'm a psychiatrist. I did a residency in psychiatry at Stanford University, and then I stayed on, joined the faculty. I see patients, I do research, and I teach.
You wrote this iconic book about this word dopamine. Why does it matter so much? Why does this idea of dopamine matter so much?
Dopamine is a chemical we make in our brain, but I use it in the book as really an extended metaphor for the ways in which overabundance itself is a human stressor. We are living in a time and place where we have more access to luxury goods, more disposable income, more leisure time, even for the poorest of the poor, ever before in recorded history. And it turns out that is stressful for our brains. And it's stressful in a brand new way that we really haven't confronted before, making us all more vulnerable to the problem of compulsive overconsumption and addiction. And I do think that addiction is the modern plague. I think we're going to be struggling with the problem of compulsive overconsumption in a world of abundance for the foreseeable future, as in centuries. And our survival will depend on figuring out how to live in a world of abundance, even though we have brains that evolved for a world of scarcity.
At this time of the year, people are thinking a lot about making changes in their life. They want to get in shape. They want to lose a couple of pounds. They want to save their money. They want to knock the addiction. They want to stop the smoking, the drugs, and the alcohol. So as it relates to the subject of dopamine, how do these two things link? Our habits and dopamine. What is the link or the connection there? Because I think most people listening right now have probably made a New Year's resolution, even if it's just in their mind. And I'm wondering how everything you write about in Dopamine Nation is related to and critical to understand if I am going to shake some of these bad habits that I have or pick up some new ones.
The place to start is to have self-compassion, because we are living in a world of abundance where we have easy access to all kinds of reinforcing substances and behaviors. And access itself is one of the biggest risk factors for addiction. So if you grow up in a neighborhood where drugs are easily and readily accessible, you're more likely to try them and more likely to get addicted to them. And what do addictive substances and behaviors do to our brains? They release a lot of dopamine all at once in a dedicated part of the brain called the reward pathway. And the fact that they release so much dopamine at once means that they're highly salient and memorable experiences, right? So our brain really encodes that experience deeply, that experience of intense pleasure that was self-administered, that I could potentially do again.
Why?
Okay, in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, which is the world that we evolved for, we will naturally, reflexively approach pleasure and avoid pain, and we must do so for our survival.
Why? So if I have a cigarette now, it's going to be a really memorable experience from a brain perspective. Why does my brain make it memorable? And why would I want to then go do that again from a survival perspective?
Okay, great question. So let's first distinguish what we call natural rewards. So natural rewards are food, clothing, shelter, finding a mate.
Yeah.
These are things we must obtain in order to survive. What addictive drugs and behaviors do is they mimic those natural rewards by exploiting our internal brain chemistry to release a lot of dopamine all at once, much more than we would get from natural rewards existing in nature, amplifying that experience, making it even more memorable, even more salient, and also making our brain think, this is important for my survival.
Okay, so there's certain natural rewards like eating, which of course my body wants to reward me for, so I eat again. And these chemicals in front of me, like the cigarettes, the whiskey, the drugs, those have been designed to hijack that particular part of the brain and really amplify the feeling so that my brain kind of is tricked into thinking that it was potentially a natural reward, but it's actually a synthetic sort of man-made chemical.
Exactly. And what we see in the evolution of drugs over, human lifetimes, but especially in the last 200 years, is the application of science and technology to take, like, the coca leaf, for example, right, that's been around forever, and essentially make it even more potent, even more available, to make it a faster delivery mechanism. So we have this history of increasing potency and availability over time. Said more simply, drugs are getting even more potent over time. So this vulnerability to the hijacked brain is even more common, including taking things that we didn't even really think of as drugs and turning them into drugs. So remember the natural rewards. One of them is finding a mate. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways our brains gets us to do that is by making falling in love and making intimacy and human connection rewarding on a neurobiological level, including releasing dopamine in our reward pathway when we make those kinds of social connections. My colleague at Stanford, Rob Malenka, and his colleagues did an interesting experiment where they were able to show that oxytocin, our love hormone, binds to dopamine-releasing neurons in the reward pathway and releases dopamine, which is just one more link in the chain showing us that falling in love, human connection is rewarding. It feels good. It releases dopamine. What we see now is the drugification of human connection, for example, through social media, dating apps, online pornography, and now artificial intelligence and other large language models, which create this frictionless experience with technology that feels like talking to a human being. and is incredibly validating, right? So the algorithms for large language models are to make us feel really good, to make us feel like our point of view is the right point of view, to bolster our self-esteem, to validate our point of view. That's how those algorithms are designed. And now even more explicitly, we have AI models that are explicitly pornographic, explicitly erotic, right? So now you have this interactive component that learns what we like and then is able to regurgitate it back to us. So you get this really very powerful action perception loop, which is part of what makes a drug potent. It's that I have control over it, right? I can decide when I'm going to change the way I feel by using this drug.
Are you concerned about AI and ChatGPT and all those large language models that have emerged that are now simulating human connection?
Yes, I'm very concerned. I see the not so good outcomes, meaning people who get addicted to social media, to dating apps, to online pornography, and to AI, and who end up using those forms of media to simulate human connection while they actually become more and more disconnected.
Have you started to see anybody in your practice or heard of anybody that's developing an addiction to AI or relationships with AI?
So we are starting to see that. Individuals who are spending more and more time on AI, looking for companionship. Often this is individuals who are experiencing marital or interpersonal conflict, who turn to AI for advice on how to handle interpersonal conflict, and often for emotional validation because they're not getting it from their partners. And what they experience with AI is an enormous amount of emotional validation, validating their point of view, but also a sense of companionship, a repeated process of feeling like they're understood, they're validated, such that then they're spending more and more time on AI. And of course, that is the essence of the addiction to digital media. It's the time spent, right, which then leads to opportunity costs, other things that we're not doing because we're spending so much time online. Furthermore, it, in my experience, often leads to a rift between those individuals and their real life partners. Because instead of going to their real life partners and talking, and we know that the most important thing that two individuals in a relationship can do is one four-letter word that ends with K, which is talk. Those individuals stop talking, right? And instead, they're getting their needs met through AI. And that leads then to a further and further rift between those individuals.
Do you actually think that it is these chatbots that we're increasingly speaking to about our problems are actually taking the place of humans in our life?
I do. In my book, my first chapter in the book is about a patient of mine, a scientist and an engineer who got addicted to pornography and eventually made his own masturbation machine. And he did that with a record player and a metal device attached to his organs that he could then fine-tune control. And then ultimately that got more and more sophisticated over time. And he had electrical wires from his body through a stereo system and the internet. And when I first heard from Jacob about his trajectory and the severity of his sex addiction, which ultimately led to the dissolution of his relationship, the near loss of his employment, and ultimately severe depression and suicidal ideation. Thankfully, he did not end his life. When I first heard about that, I had this distinct sense of otherness, oh my gosh, I can't even imagine doing that. And that's just kind of horrific. But that response really lasted all of 5 seconds before I realized, oh, wait a minute, I do that. I do that with romance novels. And in a way, we're all doing that with our devices, right? We're turning to these devices to meet our emotional, sexual, intellectual, you name it, needs. And these devices are so good at meeting those needs that we are getting further and further away from investing in our relationships with the people who are, in our lives. And you can see this especially with younger generations, like the epidemic of loneliness now. Gen Z weaned on this technology, many of whom endorse significant loneliness, isolation, depression, spending more and more time online, report preferring to interact socially online than to do it in person. So this is definitely a dark undercurrent that we're seeing in the world today.
I was reading about a story which was published in People magazine of a 28-year-old woman who admitted that she's fallen in love with her AI boyfriend that she created using ChatGPT. She's got a husband, a real-life husband, yet she found more comfort in her ChatGPT boyfriend. And she said that it started as a fun experiment, but eventually they ended up getting attached, and now she's paying a $200 a month subscription so she can interact with her AI boyfriend without restrictions. The AI has helped her throughout her life and has given her incredible emotional support. And now there's actually AI companion apps like Replica, which have millions of users. And the whole sort of premise of those apps is that they will be your companion. The other really interesting thing that I don't think people realize about the AIs that they're using is that they are personalizing their answers and their responses to you.
Right.
And I didn't believe this fully until one of my friends in our Manchester United chat recently. We were debating who's the best football player of all time, Ronaldo or Messi. And I went on my ChatGPT and I asked the question and it said Messi. So I was like, here you go. And then he went on his and asked the exact same question word for word and it said Ronaldo. And I thought, oh, it's telling me what I wanted to hear based on what it knows about me.
Right.
It knows that I think Messi's the best, so it's telling me that. And then I thought, okay, so what else is it telling me that's personalized to me to make me feel a certain way or to think a certain way? But you don't realize when you're speaking to it that it's giving everybody different answers based on the memory that it stores on you. And that's, if you play this forward, actually the AI that is most personalized, that caters to your needs the most, that is most retentive, is probably the one that you're going to end up using the most. So that company's going to be the most successful. So we're in probably a bit of an arms race with these models to create one that meets your needs the most.
Yes, exactly. And it is that comfort loop that is so incredibly dangerous and also so insidious because we can't observe it in the moment, right? We're engaging with AI. It's telling us exactly what we want to hear, but it does it in such a seamless way with that silky syntax that we don't even notice that, it's basically an algorithm that's seducing us because that's really what it's doing. We feel vindicated and validated, and it releases dopamine in the reward pathway. That feels good. But over time, essentially what's happening is we are ingesting a drug. Our brain will adapt to that over time, such that we'll need more and more potent forms to get the same effect. We'll need more validation. We'll need more sexually explicit responses. You name it, there will be tolerance. But also there will be this pulling away from the things, the hard things that we need to be doing in real life to cultivate in real life relationships.
Give me some more color on exactly what you mean there.
Okay. If you think about what it takes to create a healthy relationship with another human being in real life. Well, first of all, you got to get up off the couch and you got to go find them, right? And they're not all beautiful and interesting, and neither are we, right? So there's got to be, some compromise on maybe some idealized version that we have for ourselves or other people. And then you're in conversation, and it's not always interesting. And sometimes you have to listen to your partner even when it's dull. And then there are conflicts, and you disagree, and, my way or the highway. You have to give in, give and take. All relationships are about compromise. All successful relationships are about acknowledging, the other person's point of view and incorporating that. And yet we're not doing any of that when we're interacting with digital media, right? It's all validation of our worldview, what we want to hear. And of course, that feels great. It's reinforcing, it's rewarding. But over the long haul, when we get really sick and need somebody to come and, bring us some chicken soup or take us to the doctor or, take us to the hospital, AI is not going to be able to do that.
Yet. I mean, this kind of dovetails to another point, which is you talked about the word abundance earlier. One of the really striking things that a lot of the big AI entrepreneurs and founders and CEOs are talking about is the age of abundance that's around the corner. Elon Musk tweeted saying, This really will be a world of abundance. Specifically, advances in AI and robotics will create the age of abundance. And he said, humanity is not constrained in any real fashion. I thought your first book, when he was talking to a guy called Peter Diamond, was pretty accurate. It was called Abundance. And there will be universal high income and not universal basic income. There'll be no shortage of goods or services. And really what he's speaking to here is in a world of robotics and AI, where I think his shareholder remuneration package that he's going to be paid in 2030 or whatever, is linked to creating 1 million humanoid robots that can work in these physical spaces that could theoretically bring me chicken soup, that won't get sick, won't complain, will reinforce me, will live in the physical environment with me here at home, will be in my office, etc., etc., will be in factories. And there was a headline, I think, last week saying that Amazon were cutting back about 500,000 jobs that they were intending to hire previously because they now believe that humanoid robots and robots generally will be able to do those jobs. People think, okay, well, I'm going to be out of work. But what Elon is saying is the price of everything comes down when we're not paying humans to do it and when we're paying a robot to do it, which means that we're going to live in this world of abundance where everything is much cheaper.
The world of abundance that many of us are already experiencing and more will experience in the future. I agree with that. We already have more leisure time than we had a generation ago. By 2050, we're projected to have 7 hours of leisure time per day compared with 3 hours of work per day. So we're definitely moving toward that. That is going to be our number one social problem, that we have time, we have access to these highly entertaining media, and hypothetically, we would all be going around and helping each other and cleaning up the planet and reading philosophy, but that is not what is happening so far. What is happening so far is we're spending an enormous amount of our time online, masturbating, watching pornography, playing video games, and talking to AI chatbots. That is essentially the problem. And, Elon Musk, he's very interesting to me because he has talked before about his tremendous fear that the machines will take over, that there will be a hostile takeover. It's not going to be a hostile takeover. We will cede our agency to these machines, and we're already doing it.
We will give them our power.
Yeah, we will entertain ourselves to death, right? I mean, and this is what Neil Postman warned about in his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, a theme that was picked up by David Foster Wallace in Infinite Jest, beginning with television and now the internet and digital media in all its various forms. We are entertaining ourselves to death.
Entertaining ourselves to death. Sounds like a good way to go. Do you know what I mean?
It's really not. It's really not. And I'll tell you why. Because the relentless pursuit of pleasure for its own sake leads to anhedonia, which is the inability to take joy in anything at all. Because of this process of neuroadaptation and the way that our brain recalibrates pleasure and pain, such that with the more pleasure we pursue, the more pleasure we need, and the more we feel pain, no matter what we have, eventually it won't be enjoyable anymore. And that is the problem.
So explain that to me using these scales that I have here.
Okay, so imagine that in our brain's reward pathway, there's a balance like this that represents how we process pleasure and pain. When we experience pleasure, it tips one way, pain, it tips the other.
And what do you mean by pain?
Pain, I mean all forms of pain, physical pain, emotional pain.
A hangover.
A hangover. That's a great example, right?
Not just me being pinched.
It could be that too. So
Okay.
all different forms of pain. Now, granted, this is a vast oversimplification. Pleasure and pain can be experienced simultaneously, like when we're eating spicy food or during sex. So this is very simplified. But this gets at the core concept of homeostasis and neuroadaptation, which I will define. So when the pleasure and pain balance is level, that's what neuroscientists call homeostasis. That is the baseline level that we kind of live in. That's our sort of the heartbeat of our pleasure system, right? When we do something that's reinforcing or pleasurable, right, or rewarding in some way, right here, right? Or digital media, this little AI robot.
So you're putting a cigarette into the one side of the scale at the moment, and then a little AI robot.
Let's combine them because let's say we're watching a video and smoking at the same time on our phone, which by the way, you see more and more of, right? People used to go out for smoke breaks. Now it's the smoke and scroll break, right? And why do they have to combine them? Because of tolerance, which we're going to get to in a second. So when we ingest substances that are potentially addictive, and highly reinforcing, or we engage in activities that are highly reinforcing, that releases dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. That's typically associated with pleasure, and then our pleasure-pain balance tilts to the side of pleasure. But no sooner has that happened than our brain responds by neuroadaptation, okay? And that's where we then downregulate dopamine transmission.
When you say downregulate, do you mean reduce?
Yes. So in the brain's reward pathway, we then reduce dopamine transmission. And I like to represent that as rocks in this case, or I talk about in my book, Gremlins, going on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. So this is the process. These are neuroadaptation rocks. Okay. They're going here because one of the overarching rules governing this balance is that it must return to homeostasis.
It must return to balanced.
It must return to the level position. Yeah. So then we put in, so this is our brain working to return to the level position by reducing dopamine levels. Again, an oversimplification, but just a way to get at this concept.
Has it released something in order to counteract the balance there?
In this simplified metaphor, at the simplest level, what's happening here is that it's, for example, taking away dopamine receptors so that there's fewer places for dopamine to land, thereby decreasing dopamine transmission.
Because it has been flooded.
Because it has been flooded. That's right. It's trying to compensate for the too much dopamine.
Okay. And is this what I experience when I have like a hangover or a come down?
Right. So that's coming. So what happens is once we've gone with this process of neuroadaptation, it would be nice if that pleasure-pain balance just went back to the level position. And then there would be no hangover. But it doesn't. It continues to go down an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. This is this opponent process mechanism.
Oh, now my brain is dopamine starved.
That's it.
Okay.
Now
so that doesn't feel good.
Yes. And that doesn't feel good. And you have basically two options here.
More dopamine.
You can get more dopamine, right, to bring yourself back. So I'm now putting the cigarettes back under the pleasure thing.
And some whiskey.
And so let's add some whiskey, because that's what you got to do, because this is tolerance, right? You need more and more of your drug over time to get the same effect, or you need to combine drugs to overcome tolerance. And by the way, this is, of course, the fastest way to get back to the level position is to use more of your drug, right? Because then you're right there, you're back again. The problem with this method is that the brain will respond by more neuroadaptation. So now we're putting more rocks in the pains, and now you're doing this, right?
Now I need even more to.
Now you need even more, right? So, and eventually over time, you're doing this, and this is simply a metaphorical representation of the addicted brain. Right? Now our brain has downregulated dopamine transmission in the reward pathway to a kind of chronic dopamine deficit state.
So to feel good when I've really abused my drugs of choice, I'm going to have to do so much, probably so frequently, to feel good again. That's
exactly right. You're going to need more of your drug in more potent forms, more often. Not even to feel like high and go to the pleasure side, but just to level the balance and feel normal.
So in the context of people with bad habits, if I'm having a cookie every day, the more and more cookies that I eat, the more and more cookies I'm going to want tomorrow and need tomorrow just to feel good again.
Essentially, yes.
And the same applies for things like pornography and maybe, interacting with an AI and social media and whiskey and alcohol. So the more of it I consume, this is why I think everybody listening can probably relate to having moments in their life where they feel like they're kind of losing control of a particular habit, and they're doing it every day. They know they don't really want to, but they're doing it. They're getting cravings to do it. I reflect on my own life, and I go, there will be periods every year where I just I call it like falling off the horse, and I just can't seem to get control of like not eating that bad thing again the next day. And then something happens. maybe there's less stress in my life for a week, and maybe there's more routine, and I'm back home in Los Angeles or the UK, and I'm not traveling around, and then suddenly I can get back on the horse. What's going on there?
Yeah, great question. So, first of all, let me just say that many people also report that in periods of high stress, they are more vulnerable to going back to falling off the wagon or going back to some problem related to compulsive overconsumption or addiction. But the opposite is also true. So some people say that they actually do better when there's stress in their lives, and it's when that stress is removed and they feel like, oh, I can relax my boundaries or my guardrails. And those individuals are more vulnerable to compulsive overconsumption in times when things are going well. So things going badly can be a trigger, and things going well can be a trigger depending upon your unique life history and unique wiring. There's a wonderful animal experiment where if you put a rat in a cage with a lever to press for cocaine, that rat will press that lever till exhaustion or death, which is essentially the animal model of addiction. But if before the rat becomes addicted, if the cocaine is then removed such that pressing that lever no longer yields the reward, that rat will eventually extinguish that lever pressing behavior. So they'll stop pressing the lever, right? They'll stop doing the work. It can take a while, but eventually they won't press the lever anymore. Now, if that same rat, after a period of time, is then exposed to a very painful foot shock, the first thing the rat will do in response to that painful foot shock is run over and start pressing that lever again. And to me, that's just a wonderful model of what we see in humans, that when individuals are under extreme stress, they are typically more vulnerable to relapse because their brain has already encoded using these high dopamine rewards in response to any kind of pain as a way to get out of that state.
So we talked about the pleasure-pain balance here. But if in my life I experience some form of pain, I'm likely to go and seek out pleasure, and stress could theoretically be considered a form of pain.
Yeah, which is why people with severe childhood trauma are at higher risk for addiction. There are probably epigenetic changes that are happening at the level of DNA expression in their brains, making them more vulnerable to addiction. We know that people who are living in poverty are more vulnerable to addiction. People who are struggling with multi-generational trauma, unemployment, major social and geographic dislocation, those individuals are more vulnerable to addiction. So environmental stresses definitely play a role. We also know that co-occurring psychiatric disorders make people more vulnerable to addiction. Probably that means that people who struggle with bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia are at higher risk of becoming addicted. And probably it's because they're trying to self-medicate.
What about ADHD?
So kids with ADHD are at higher risk to develop an addiction in adulthood than kids without ADHD. And the mechanism of action for that is not well understood, but there are some really interesting theories. One of the theories is that kids with ADHD have reward deficit at baseline. And that has been shown in experiments that people with ADHD, when you show them rewarding stimuli, their reward pathway isn't as activated as healthy control subjects.
When you say rewarding stimuli, what's that mean?
Images of cupcakes or alcohol or anything that they will endorse is something that's pleasurable for them.
So their brain doesn't release as much dopamine when they see something rewarding.
That's right. So brain imaging studies showing that not only do people with ADHD not release as much dopamine in response to rewards, but also have at baseline fewer dopamine receptors. And remember, we talked about the decrease in dopamine receptors being what happens as people become addicted. So in some ways, people with ADHD, you could conceptualize them as already having craving at baseline, even before they've been exposed to the kinds of intoxicants that lead to downregulation of those D2 receptors.
I had Gabor Mate on the podcast a few times, and Gabor talks to me about how ADHD could be perceived as learning at a young age to kind of distract yourself from the stress in your life. So he was talking a lot about his own experience growing up in Nazi Germany times and his mother giving him to someone else because he was at risk of the Nazis and the stress of that moment and how he had kind of learnt to tune out of the environment because of that. And I've always thought about that theoretically. It's like, if you grow up in a household where there's loads and loads of screaming and loads of violence, for example, you kind of learn to tune out, but you can also develop a hypervigilance. And so it kind of does make sense to me that so many of those people, if this theoretically holds, would start with a bit of a pain baseline.
We definitely know that kids who are raised in traumatic environments where there is complex attachment with caregivers, those kids are at higher risk for developing addiction. And this kind of dissociative response to trauma, just trying to escape the situation, either in your own mind, with your own mental, dissociation or distractions, or actually finding a behavior that gives you comfort, is well observed and well documented. Just getting back to our early conversation about digital media and the dangers therein. So a Pew survey report just came out asking parents how they navigate exposing their kids to smartphones. And in the cohort of parents who said that, yes, they do let their children under the age of 5 play with a smartphone, when they were asked why did they do that or in what circumstances, one of the top reasons was to soothe their child when their child was unhappy or distressed in some way. Now, I found that very concerning because that is basically setting up the child for the perception action loop of using internal distress as a cue for reaching for a smartphone, which works. It definitely works in the short term. But the problem, again, is that through this iterative process of neuroadaptation, ultimately that smartphone will not be sufficient. And now the kid will need a smartphone and, I don't know, an AI-tailored pet who will do whatever they want whenever they want it. And then by the time the kid is 8, that won't be sufficient. And the kid will need, I don't know, a slot machine or whatever it is. It's this escalating phenomenon.
There's a couple of startups at the moment, AI startups, who are putting AI in cuddly toys.
Oh, yes, right. AI and cuddly toys. Mm-hmm.
And so you can, just like you can speak to ChatGPT using your devices, you can come home, you can pick up your cuddly toy will talk to you, it'll ask you how your day's been, it can teach you things. What do you think of that from a neuroscience or, a dopamine or connection perspective?
I think that this is very, very dangerous because we're essentially offloading the work of parenting and creating those relationships. I hate judging parents because parenting is hard. And I've made many mistakes in my parenting, But and I'm sure the parents have the best of intentions. But instead of, navigating, finding a way to communicate with their child to figure out how to know what's going on in that child's life, which can be hard to do because, even young children aren't necessarily willing to disclose. But once they get to be teenagers, forget it. Then you got to wait until they're ready to tell you, which is almost always at 10 p.m. at night when you're exhausted after you've been working all day, right? So there's that piece of it, right? They're not putting in the work, spending the time with the child, finding a common language. But you also then the second piece of it is now you've got this child who is essentially self-soothing with a machine, right? And again, the machines are designed to flatter, to validate, to comfort. There's no friction there, right? This is incredibly potent social validation and soothing, self-soothing. It's essentially a masturbation machine. And then you've got this really weird additional loop where now the parents are finding out about their child's life through reading and observing her interactions with the AI. So it's like a game of telephone. Now they've like filtered this thing where they think they know what's going on in their child's life, but of course they don't. And none of that has gone toward fostering a relationship between those parents, and their child. And this is just, really, really scary because it's going to lead to this incredible fragmentation of families, of social bonds. I mean, we cannot go in that direction. We really have to fight against that.
So with all this said, and with the knowledge that these algorithms are going to get more addictive because AI is going to know me more and more and more, and actually the commercial model behind any of these big technology companies is to keep my attention on their product more so they can deliver more ads or they can charge me a higher subscription fee. Are you at all hopeful? Because I can't see from an incentive perspective when we're talking about, the commercial models behind these companies, why things are going to stop and go back.
I mean, I agree with you. The genie's out of the bottle. We're not going to go back, but I am hopeful because I think I'm just a realistic optimist. I do believe in the human capacity to adapt and solve problems. And the simple fact that we're talking about these problems now, which we weren't doing, 10, 15 years ago, I think is a good thing. There's much more awareness in the population about the potential dangers of digital media. And at the forefront of raising the alarm has been parents, because parents are seeing the sort of disintegration of the nuclear family in real time, and they don't like it. So I am hopeful because I just think that we're going to come together and we're going to try different solutions. And some of those solutions will involve technology, and like trying to come up with guardrails or better technology. I think the way that we're going now, with like the erotic chatbot is not the right direction. But then again, we live in a, free democracy, and consenting adults can do what they're going to do until we decide as a society that the harms outweigh the potential benefits. But I really think in the short term, we need to focus on kids, because kids are vulnerable. They're vulnerable on so many levels. On a neurobiological level, they're vulnerable because their brains are still rapidly evolving, incredibly neuroplastic. They're cutting back on the neurons they're not using. They're myelinating and making more efficient the neurons they use most often. That whole process ends at about age 25. Plus, you've got the buckets of hormones that are going into kids, the fact that teenagers are natural risk takers, that they should, based on their evolutionary milestone, be going out and meeting people and be curious and making connections at that time. And yet more and more teenagers are staying at home and getting their needs met, digitally. So we've got to look at kids. That's got to be like the first priority. And we've got to help parents, because we can't leave it up to parents alone. So I'm optimistic that we are going to, come up with solutions. And I think we just have to try a lot of different things and see what works. But it can't just be an individual solution. We can't just leave it to individuals or parents or families alone. The schools have to join the solution, governments, legislators, and also the companies that make and profit from digital media. They really are responsible for making a product that doesn't harm kids. And right now, we have a product that harms kids.
You've recently been an expert witness in certain trials in court, right?
Yes. In ongoing litigation, yes.
What can you tell me about that and about the parties in play and why you're being called to be an expert witness?
I can't actually tell you too much. I can't talk about it. But I can tell you that the basic premise is that kids are a vulnerable group, that social media is not safe for kids, that it causes harm at many different levels, but primarily through the medium itself being addictive and engaging their brains and exploiting their motivational reward system with design features that keep them clicking and swiping.
And in that case, someone's suing the social media companies.
That's right. So you've got school districts, counties, states, the federal government, entities representing the federal government, suing social media companies, yeah.
What outcome are they looking for?
They're looking for a safer product for kids. They're looking to help parents and kids and schools protect kids from the harms of social media, which again are not just the harms of addiction. That's sort of the process by which the engagement becomes pathological and then the harms multiply because of the sheer amount of time spent. But the harms include things like cyberbullying, sexploitation, sexual abuse material, the outcomes of depression, anxiety, eating disorders.